That drawer, you know the one, Nokia Pop Port tangled with Sony Ericsson Fast Port, Apple 30-pin wedged beneath a Samsung brick. Every cable once essential, every one now useless. Dozens of proprietary connectors competed for your pocket, and the companies behind them made billions keeping it that way. That pile is what pushed the European Union to mandate one universal charger, threatening $2 billion in annual revenue for one company alone. To understand how a cable became worth legislating, you have to start with why the chaos existed in the first place. By 2003, a new kind of arms race was underway, not for megapixels or ringtones, but for the right to control the port at the bottom of your phone. Every major brand had its own signature plug. Nokia's Pop Port, a 14-pin marvel of engineering, turned the humble charging cable into a passport for a closed ecosystem. It was not just about powering up. Pop Port carried audio, data, and a secret handshake for accessories. If your headset or cable did not speak Nokia's language, the phone would ignore it, no matter how desperately you needed a charge. Sony Ericsson countered with Fast Port, a 12-pin connector that promised to do it all: power, music, data, maybe even make your coffee if you found the right accessory. Fast Port accessories had to pass Sony's own compatibility checks, and third-party makers paid for the privilege to play in their sandbox. Meanwhile, Samsung rolled out a chunky 24-pin connector, big enough to double as a doorstop. Each of these designs was a fortress, built to keep outsiders at bay. Apple, ever the perfectionist, took things further with the 30-pin dock connector. Debuting on the iPod in 2003, it soon became the only way to connect an iPhone or iPad to the outside world. 30 pins meant room for everything: charging, data, video, even FireWire for the brave. But the real magic trick was the MFI program. Every cable, dock, or speaker had to be licensed, with Apple collecting a royalty on each one. By the late 2000s, analysts estimated Apple's MFI licensing brought in about $2 billion a year. That is a lot of white cables and a powerful reason to keep things exclusive. For engineers, proprietary connectors were a technical playground. They could pack more features into a single port, squeeze every millimeter of space, and show off their brand's latest trick. For marketers, these plugs were golden handcuffs. Once you bought a phone, you were nudged to stick with the same brand, just to avoid buying a new set of cables and accessories. Even the most basic tasks, charging your phone at a friend's house, became a compatibility lottery. Accessory makers had to pay for development kits, sign non-disclosure agreements, and hand over a slice of every sale. Nokia's accessory licensing pulled in over 150 million euros a year in the mid-2000s, while Sony Ericsson's Fast Port royalties and Samsung's accessory program added to the pile. Consumers, meanwhile, were left with drawers full of cables that worked with nothing else, and a creeping suspicion that maybe, just maybe, this chaos was not an accident. The result was a world where every phone launch meant a new cable, a new charger, and another layer of frustration. The tangle of Pop Port, Fast Port, and 30-pin connectors was not just a design quirk, it was a business model. Each connector kept users loyal, kept competitors out, and kept the money flowing in. But as the piles of orphaned chargers grew, so did the calls for a better way. In 2009, phone manufacturers gathered in Brussels to sign a memorandum of understanding, agreeing to adopt micro USB charging ports on new smartphones sold in the European Union. The move, encouraged by the European Commission and the USB Implementers Forum, aimed to end the confusion of incompatible chargers. For a brief moment, it looked like the era of tangled drawers and brand-specific cables might be coming to an end. Yet the pact was voluntary, not binding. Manufacturers interpreted compliance loosely. Samsung and HTC added micro USB to many models, but kept proprietary ports alive on budget devices. Apple sidestepped the agreement entirely, bundling a micro USB to 30-pin adapter with iPhones. Technically compliant, but still locking users into its own cable system. The loopholes left plenty of room for business as usual. Micro USB did bring some order. By 2013, over 80% of Android phones in Europe used the slim connector. It was cheap and standardized in shape, but its technical limits soon became clear. Micro USB capped out at 5 volts and 2 amps, restricting charging speeds. Data transfer rates stalled at 480 megabits per second. As smartphones demanded more power and faster data, these constraints became impossible to ignore. The introduction of USB-C in 2014 marked a turning point. The new connector was fully reversible, eliminating the frustration of trying to plug it in the right way. USB-C could deliver up to 100 watts of power, enough to charge laptops and transfer data at up to 10 gigabits per second. It supported alternate modes like DisplayPort and Thunderbolt, hinting at a future where one cable could handle everything from charging to high-resolution video. But the real challenge was invisible. Even as USB-C ports appeared on flagship devices, fast charging remained a mess. Some phones used the open USB power delivery standard, which allowed any compliant charger to negotiate voltage and current. Others stuck with proprietary systems like Qualcomm's Quick Charge or Oppo's VOOC, each demanding its own handshake. Plug in the wrong charger, and charging slowed to a crawl. Apple's Lightning connector, launched in 2012, added another layer. Smaller than USB-C and just as reversible, Lightning relied on a proprietary authentication chip. Only licensed MFI certified cables could unlock full charging and data speeds. For users, Lightning felt seamless until it met a non-Apple device. A tech analyst put it plainly, "We finally got a universal plug, but not a universal language." On January 1st, 2024, a new rule went into effect across the European Union. Every new smartphone, tablet, e-reader, and handheld device sold in member states must come equipped with a USB-C charging port. This wasn't a friendly suggestion or a handshake agreement. It was the kind of law that comes with enforcement muscle and a clear timeline. The text of Directive 2022-2380 spells it out. No more proprietary ports for handheld electronics, and no more excuses. If a device can't charge with a USB-C cable, it can't be sold in the EU. The scope is broad, covering everything from phones and tablets to portable speakers and wearables, as long as the battery doesn't exceed 20 watt-hours. Laptops and larger devices get a temporary reprieve, but only until January 1st, 2027. After that, even notebooks and gaming consoles must comply, supporting USB-C with power delivery up to 100 watts. The law even sets a minimum bar, at least 5 volts and 3 amps for handhelds, and much higher for laptops. So manufacturers can't sneak by with underpowered ports. Enforcement isn't left to chance. Each EU country's market surveillance authority, like Germany's Bundesnetzagentur or France's DGCCRF, has the job of spot-checking devices on store shelves and online listings. Manufacturers must file a declaration of conformity and technical documentation within 30 days of launching a new product. If a phone or laptop flunks the test, regulators can pull it from the market, issue recalls, and impose fines up to 6% of the company's annual EU turnover for each non-compliant device. That's not just a slap on the wrist. For a global tech giant, it can mean hundreds of millions of euros. The directive's rollout was anything but smooth. Committee debates in Brussels ran late into the night, with some policymakers worried about stifling innovation. What if the next breakthrough in charging doesn't fit the USB-C mold? Others, like Commissioner Thierry Breton, argued that the mountain of e-waste and consumer frustration outweighed those risks. In the end, the vote was close, but the law passed, and the deadlines were locked in. For tech companies, this wasn't just a new hoop to jump through. It was a clear signal that the days of proprietary charging ecosystems were numbered. The EU had drawn a bright line, and everyone, Apple included, would have to cross it. Inside Apple's headquarters, the Lightning port was more than a technical achievement. It was a golden gate. Launched in 2012, Lightning's compact reversible design set Apple devices apart, but the real power flowed through the MFI program. Every certified cable, dock, or adapter needed Apple's blessing, and that blessing came with a royalty. By the late 2010s, analysts pegged MFI licensing at around $2 billion a year, a stream of revenue built on every white cable sold in airport kiosks and every speaker dock on a teenager's nightstand. Lightning wasn't just a connector, it was a moat, keeping users and accessory makers firmly inside Apple's ecosystem. But as the European Union's Universal Charger Directive gained steam, Apple faced a dilemma. Internal emails later leaked to the press revealed a tug of war. The Lightning accessory unit argued that the existing ecosystem was too big to disrupt, hundreds of millions of accessories, millions of customers, and a licensing engine that padded the bottom line. On the other side, Apple's industrial designers and regulatory teams warned the European Union's new law was not a negotiation. If Apple did not switch to USB-C, iPhones would disappear from the European market, along with billions in annual sales. The stakes went beyond lost revenue. The MFI program was a carefully tuned machine, rewarding loyalty and punishing knockoffs. USB-C, by contrast, was an open standard, royalty-free, and shared by rivals. Moving to USB-C meant giving up control, not just over cables, but over the entire accessory ecosystem. For a company built on seamless integration, that was a hard pill to swallow. The internal debate dragged on. In 2021, a senior Apple engineer told Reuters they were preparing a USB-C transition roadmap for the iPhone 15, but the Lightning team was fighting to keep the legacy port for at least another generation. The pressure was relentless. The European Union's law spelled out real consequences. Fail to comply and face fines up to 6% of annual European turnover. For Apple, that could mean hundreds of millions lost in a single year. In September 2023, Apple announced the iPhone 15 would ship with USB-C. The official line was all about consumer convenience and sustainability. Behind the scenes, the calculus was simple: keep selling in Europe or cling to a proprietary port and risk being shut out. The move made headlines around the world. In Brussels, regulators called it a victory for consumers and the environment. In Cupertino, the transition meant retooling factories, rewriting accessory contracts, and preparing for a new world where the cable in your pocket might work with almost anything. The Lightning era was ending, not with a technical breakthrough, but with a legal deadline and a business decision too big to ignore. A universal charger isn't just a convenience upgrade, it's a numbers game with real-world impact. The European Environment Agency projects that standardizing to USB-C could prevent 1.5 million tons of electronic waste by 2030 across the EU alone. That is the equivalent of scrapping the annual waste from 2 million smartphones, all thanks to fewer redundant chargers tossed in the trash. The United Nations e-waste monitor goes even bigger, estimating that if adopted worldwide, universal chargers could cut charger-related waste by 10 to 15%, saving 2.2 million tons by 2035. For consumers, the math is just as striking. Eurostat surveys show that after the EU's 2024 mandate, 68% of households reported saving between €20 and €30 per year on chargers. Those savings, when multiplied across the bloc, climbed to €1.2 billion a year by 2026, according to McKinsey's modelling. The reason is simple: fewer cables to buy, less confusion, and less money spent replacing lost or incompatible chargers. But the transition hasn't been painless. The shift from Apple's Lightning to USB-C left a mountain of orphaned accessories. Between 2021 and 2022, the rush to swap out Lightning gear generated roughly 500,000 tons of extra waste, as adapters and legacy cables hit the recycling bins. Companies like Belkin faced their own hurdles. Retooling a major charger factory in the Czech Republic cost 4.2 million euros, and minimum order sizes for USB-C parts doubled overnight. Belkin's operations chief summed it up: the upfront investment was steep, but in the long run, fewer product variations mean simpler logistics and lower costs per unit. For small accessory makers, though, the story is more complicated. Some lost revenue as niche cables faded, while others scrambled to reinvent themselves with premium USB-C offerings. The numbers lay bare the trade-offs: massive e-waste reduction and real consumer savings, offset by short-term transition pains and industry shakeups. These are the stakes that shaped the battle for a universal charger and the math regulators used to make their case. India's Bureau of Indian Standards took a close look at the European playbook and decided to run with it, only with its own twist. In 2022, Indian regulators launched a working group on common chargers, setting their sights on a 2026 deadline for USB-C across all mobile devices, including laptops. That's a broader sweep than the European Union's first wave, and it reflects India's vast, price-sensitive market, where budget Android phones still dominate. The Bureau's draft does not just copy the European rules, it leaves the door open for future magnetic charging standards after 2030, hedging against the risk of locking out next-generation technology before it arrives. In the United States, the debate has taken a different turn. Hearings in the Senate Commerce Committee in March 2024 brought together Apple, Google, and a representative from the European Commission. Apple's argument was familiar. A one-size-fits-all mandate would force a costly redesign for millions of accessories, with those costs passed on to consumers. Google, on the other hand, pointed to the Pixel line's early adoption of USB-C as proof that voluntary convergence can work. Lawmakers pressed for evidence on e-waste and consumer savings, but the proposed Universal Charger Act, S2456, remains stalled in committee. No federal mandate has cleared the floor, though some states and major retailers have started labeling USB-C compatibility as a selling point. The European Union's directive may have set the tone, but the global picture is far from uniform. India is moving forward with its own timeline and technical flexibility. The United States is still weighing whether to legislate or let the market sort things out. What's clear is that the pressure to standardize is not limited to Europe. As regulators from Delhi to Washington study the European Union's results, device makers face a world where the shape of a charging port is no longer just a design choice. It is a policy flashpoint. Wireless charging once promised a future free from tangled cables and mismatched ports, but in practice, the horizon is still cloudy. The most widely adopted standard, Qi, now supports up to 30 watts of power, enough to top off a phone overnight, but not nearly enough for a laptop or tablet that needs a quick boost. For devices with bigger batteries, wireless charging means longer waits, and sometimes a return to the trusty cable when time is tight. The wireless landscape isn't as universal as the word suggests. Qi leads on most Android phones, while Apple's MagSafe system, though technically Qi compatible, adds its own layer of authentication. Then there is Air Fuel, a rival standard used mostly in niche devices and some wearables. Each system has its quirks, and without a single protocol, the risk of a new kind of fragmentation looms, one where your charging pad works with some devices but not others, and the promise of convenience gives way to a new round of compatibility puzzles. Moving past physical ports also brings fresh concerns about repair and longevity. With no charging port, diagnosing power issues or replacing a battery becomes trickier. The European Union's right to repair laws, designed to keep devices fixable, could clash with a fully wireless world, where even basic repairs might require specialized tools or manufacturer-only service modes. For regulators, this raises a thorny question. Should the next round of universal charging rules set standards for wireless too, or risk letting the industry drift back toward proprietary islands, this time invisible, but just as isolating? As wireless charging edges forward, the debate over standards and repairability is far from settled. The next chapter in the universal charger story may be written not by cables, but by the invisible handshake between coil, chip, and policy. Will the future be truly universal, or will the cycle of fragmentation start anew? Today, USB-C sits in almost every new device, not by accident, but by law. As the US and India weigh similar rules, the line between smart regulation and stifled innovation grows thinner. Universal chargers promise less e-waste, but also less choice. Should governments decide what plugs into your phone, or should markets? Let us know where you stand in the comments below.